Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honour to be standing in the legislature to continue to deliver my inaugural address. I represent residents in the beautiful riding of Flamborough-Glanbrook, and although I have had the privilege of calling Hamilton my home for over 3 decades, I was actually born in Northern Ontario, in Sudbury, and raised in the nearby town of Capreol. I had some amazing role models in my life. 2 of the most influential were women. My mother taught me humility and the value of hard work. At the age of 37, I watched her swallow her pride and walk into our local high school and sit in a classroom with kids the same age as my older sister. She had always wanted to get her high school diploma, and she had the courage to do it. It wasn't easy. She was often teased, but the kids who chided her soon showed up at our home in the evening, and she began to tutor them. She went on to teach some of those kids and then became the executive assistant to the senior manager at a local hospital and then at Hannah Mines. Her efforts were the catalyst for the first adult education program that was launched in our town. I didn't know it at the time, but my grandmother was the first feminist in my life. She was a tiny, gentle soul who raised 10 children, including my mother. During the 1930s, at the height of the Depression, my grandmother took in boarders, ran a postal outlet from her home, while at the same time operating a restaurant and a gas station. I was certainly blessed to have these 2 strong women as role models, and I recognize how much they have influenced many of the decisions that I have made in my life. I left home when I was 17 years old. I really didn't have a choice because, as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a broadcaster, which meant leaving the security of a small town and heading out on my own. I'd managed to save about $300 from my summer job, which was enough to get me to Toronto. I had applied and was accepted to the radio-television program at Seneca College, but beyond that, I really had no idea what direction my life would take. I had no place to live, and I'd never really even been on public transit, but somehow I figured it out. After college, I was hired at Rideau Carleton Raceway in Ottawa to work in the Public Relations Department. My boss was a big guy with an even bigger heart. His name was Des Smith. He was a former NHL player who had won the Stanley Cup when he played for the Boston Bruins. His son Brian, a sportscaster for CJOH in Ottawa, an Ottawa television station, was later murdered in a tragic, unprovoked shooting outside the television station. From Ottawa, I headed to Quebec, Fauquelonge, Quebec, and a job at a small community radio station. When I say small, I mean small. We didn't even have a washroom. To get a washroom break, I would put on a very, very, very long record, run home to my small apartment, use the washroom, and get back to start the next record. And I am so proud to say that I never missed a beat. Broadcasting was my passion. It gave me a front-row seat to living and breathing history. My career afforded me opportunities that most people could never imagine. I've covered murders and murder trials, fires and fundraisers. I've worked in front of and behind the camera, reported, produced, hosted, and anchored. I've interviewed some pretty incredible people: Prime Ministers Stephen Harper and Paul Martin, the President of Israel, Shimon Peres, actress Sophia Loren, just to name a few.
Wow, impressive.
I traveled deep into the jungles of El Salvador with volunteers from World Vision. I flew to Doha, Qatar during the First Gulf War, where I interviewed members of the Canadian military at our base, Canada Dry 1. I also tried to interview Qatari government officials and was given a cold, hard lesson on the rights of journalists in the Middle East. But while I was there, I visited a racetrack where rich sheikhs bet on million-dollar camels. On the backs of those camels were children, tied or velcroed to a saddle, kids 4, 5, and 6 years of age who had been sold into slavery or kidnapped from India, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka. Before I moved to Hamilton, I lived and worked in Kingston. And when Canada's federal government announced it was going to be closing the P4W, or Prison for Women, I called them and asked if I could spend a couple of days and perhaps even a night in prison. They said yes, And I did. I've done a lot of things in my career, but that night truly changed me. Until then, there had only been one federal prison in Canada for female inmates, but the federal government was embarking on a program to expand into other provinces. Most of the women had been transferred out of P4W, except for 15 who were considered the highest security risks. I remember arriving at the prison. I was searched and asked for my identification, specifically my driver's license. They were checking for traces of cocaine. I spent the day and evening talking to a number of inmates. They willingly shared their stories. One woman told me she had been living in Canada, just outside of Ottawa, and had been working with a gang member selling drugs. She heard that the police were going to arrest them, so they fled, headed out west. She said it wasn't long before they ran out of money, so they stopped a car driven by a 19-year-old girl and forced her to drive them back to Ontario. Along the way, they drained her bank account. And then, when they arrived in Ottawa, they attacked her and left her for dead. But that young woman survived. And that story, as horrific as it was, wasn't all that unusual among that group of women. Their crimes were ugly and violent, much like the atmosphere of the facility where they were housed. That night, I slept in a cell in the infirmary. I remember looking out the window. The walls were solid stone, about a foot thick, and they were topped with barbed wire. A guard stood watching from the tower. I didn't sleep at all that night. It was just so surreal. Years later, while sitting in my office watching CBC News, I recognized a young woman on television. She was one of the inmates who I had spent the evening with at the prison for women. I remember her, how tiny she was. She was just a waif of a woman. She was quiet, one of the few who didn't talk openly about her story. Her name was Tammy, and she was serving a life sentence for murdering her son. But the day I watched her on television was the day authorities announced that she was being released because she had been wrongfully convicted. Tammy was one of the many victims of disgraced pathologist Charles Smith, whose questionable practices triggered a judicial inquiry. Not only had Tammy spent over 10 years behind bars for a crime she didn't commit, she had lost custody of her 2 surviving children. I've always been inquisitive. It's my nature. But I also love to take on new challenges. In 2000, I launched my own company called News for Hamilton. It was a cutting-edge online local news and information service. I'd taken a huge risk at a time when high-speed internet service was in its infancy. My company, News for Hamilton, was one of the first such local news sites of its kind. It had been written up in business and industry magazines worldwide. I worked at CHCH Television in Hamilton for almost 30 years. It was more than a job. It was an incredible experience. Friendships were forged, and in many cases, colleagues were closer than families, often sharing late evenings and celebrating many, many holidays together. In 2009, CHCH was threatened with closure after CanWest Global, the station's owner at the time, went bankrupt. I led a successful campaign to help save CHCH TV. I traveled to Ottawa in order to appeal directly to the Canadian Radio and Television Commission to do something to save the station. And in many ways, I became the face of the station in the media. I simply could not accept the fact that CHCH, the oldest independent television station in Canada with its storied history, could go black. But then new owners came forward, and I supported their bid to purchase the station. And business carried on as usual until the darkest day of my professional career, December 11th, 2015. That day, I, along with more than 100 of my colleagues, were herded into a studio and blindsided by the news that CHCH was filing for bankruptcy. We were being terminated. We discovered that our owners had set up a series of numbered companies. The assets were placed in one company. It was fine, but unbeknownst to all of the employees, they'd been working for another company with no assets. And with the stroke of a pen, that company was declared bankrupt, and we were all out of work, with no severance, not a penny, and Christmas was just 2 weeks away. I was shell-shocked. I had no job. I was devastated, and I asked myself, What was I going to do? I had 2 sons and no job. But it was my sons who gave me strength. I remember that night that we all lost our jobs, and my oldest son, Dane, hugging me, saying, "You know what, Mom? If we have to sell the house and move into an apartment, then that's what we'll do. I'll quit school, and I'll get a job. Cole can quit school, and he can get a job. But we'll get through this." Well, they didn't quit school, and we didn't sell the house. But we did get through it. I started looking for work immediately and was hired by our local all-news radio station to cover the Tim Bosma murder trial. Dellen Millard and his co-accused, Mark Smith, were being tried in a Hamilton courtroom for the senseless murder of the Ancaster father. And for the next few weeks, I reported on that case. Around the same time, a seat opened up on Hamilton City Council. A by-election was going to be held in the spring, and I had to make a decision. Would I run? I love journalism. It's in my DNA, but there was something about the political arena that kept tugging at me. I'm a veteran campaigner. I'd been a candidate in 2 previous provincial elections. Well, I entered the race against 22 other candidates, and I won the by-election in Ward 7 by less than 100 votes. I can tell you my journey to Queen's Park was a 7-year struggle that actually began during an interview on Square Off, a television show that I co-hosted with Mark Hebscher. I was interviewing a Liberal politician about Dalton McGuinty's Green Energy Act, and I thought, this plan is crazy, and this government has to be stopped. Well, fast forward, folks, 15 years, and now we see what has happened, and the green energy policy is being stopped. I've always been moved by perceived injustices. I served his term as union president at CHCH. I fought for fairness. I fought for better wages for those employees at the bottom of the wage scale. I stood up for the people who felt they didn't have a voice, and I intend to give that same voice to my constituents in Flamborough-Glanbrook. It truly is an honour to be able to stand in these hollow chambers every day with my friends and my colleagues. It took 7 years to get here, but I'm so proud to be able to say I'm now a member of this legislature.
We're glad you're here.
A provincial parliament for Flamborough-Glanbrook. But as I mentioned, the journey to get here takes the support of a loving family and truly an army of volunteers. To all of the men and women who knocked on doors in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the summer, on cold winter days, on hot summer nights, to all of the men and women who helped me raise money, who begged for money, and in particular to all of the men and women who stood by my side, in particular my campaign manager, Grant McLean, and to my dear friend Barb Webster, who, as I said, were by my side every step of the way. To all of you, a sincere thank you. To my mother, my father, my stepfather, my brother Doug, my sister-in-law Gal, my sister Sharon, thank you for believing in me. To my sons, Dane and Cole, and my daughter Madison, I hope to make you as proud as you have made me. And finally, to the people of Flamborough-Glanbrook, you believed in me. You believed in the Conservative government's promise to make life better for you and all of the people of Ontario. And I'm proud to stand here today and every day to be able to say, promises made, promises kept.